Hi, everyone. Pastor Bruce from the Arkport Presbyterian Church, and it's good to be with you again for another biblical archaeological video lesson. This week, we finally do get back to Jerusalem to talk about the Pool of Siloam and King Hezekiah's tunnel. But we don't want to just study neat things that we see in the ground without understanding their context. And to understand their context, well, we had to go on a long journey, a journey that involves a war between Assyria and Judah. But we've done the hard work, and now it's time to reap the harvest. We're back to Jerusalem, talking about the Pool of Siloam and King Hezekiah's tunnel. Very interesting things to see. Well, to get to our lesson, let me put my inset video aside, and that way it won't obstruct any of our slides this morning. Well, let's just review for us how we got here. We got here because King Sargon II died in a battle, and his body was captured by the enemies of Assyria, enemies to the north, and that was considered a bad omen. And when a king dies, we've seen that this is an opportunity for a nation perhaps to break into civil war. It's also an opportunity for enemy states to invade, or if they are vassal states, if they are under states, it's a time for them to break away. And indeed, that's exactly what Babylon and Judah are trying to do. They're trying to break away from the yoke of the Assyrian Empire, so they don't have to pay a yearly tribute, and they want to be fully independent. And King Merodach-Baladan of Babylon, he makes a pact with King Hezekiah, and they and other nations are going to revolt against Assyria while Sargon II's son is sorting things out. Well, unfortunately for them, King Sennacherib sorts things out rather quickly, and he at first moves against Merodach-Baladan of Babylonia. He reestablishes Assyrian rule, puts his son in charge, but Merodach-Baladan escapes yet again. That is an annoyance that he keeps escaping rather than being captured and killed. Well, now that Babylon is secure, King Sennacherib turns his attention to Judah and King Hezekiah. He brings his armies to the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon. They transport down by sea into Philistia, where the Philistines are. He reasserts his rule over the Philistines. The Egyptians send an expeditionary force, a large expeditionary force, but probably the Assyrians fight them to some sort of a standstill. Now, the Egyptians and the Assyrians both claim victory, but what we know from history is the Egyptians did not pester the Assyrians anymore, and the Assyrians did not bring their campaign down into Egypt at this time. So I'll just call it a standstill. Now that the standstill has been established, that Assyrian rule has been reestablished in Philistine, it's time for King Sennacherib and his armies to punish Judah and to punish King Hezekiah. And we covered that last week in some detail with a very famous siege of the second most important city in all of Judah, the fortified walled city of Lachish. Well, King Sennacherib, he liked to record his campaigns, his military campaigns, and he did so on what's known as a prism. It's a large hexagonal clay, well, it's a block that has clay on it that cuneiform writing can be written onto it, and it can be baked. And there are actually 3 copies of Sennacherib's campaign annals known as Sennacherib's prism. This one is called Taylor's prism. It is called Taylor because of the individual who discovered it. And on one of the panels, I'll just wanted to read for you what's in bold, a translation of the cuneiform writing. In my first campaign, see, it's in the first person, Sennacherib's prism. In my first campaign, I accomplished the defeat of Merodach-Baladan, king of Babylonia. He named some other little kingdoms that he also defeated. When we turn to another side of the prism, the six-sided prism, what's known as panel 4, we have this translation. As for King Hezekiah, the Jew, who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his strong walled cities, as well as small cities in their neighborhood. And he goes on to talk about how he conquered them, how he used siege equipment against them, and how he brought people and livestock off into captivity into Babylon. The spoils of war, if you will. And it's interesting that the biblical record and the archaeological record agree about the people, the places, the times, the events, and even many of the details. This is how we understand that the Bible is written not just as a spiritual story, but it's written as true history. Well, King Hezekiah is no fool. He knows the Assyrian army is formidable. He knows that the Assyrian people are vicious, especially if they conquer people who have been disloyal to them. So King Hezekiah is making preparations. He sees the revolt is not going as he had hoped. He sees that the Assyrians have dispatched Merodach-Baladan, retaken Babylon, and now his forces are coming to him. And they see that they are laying waste to the walled cities of Judah. Now, I say he's no fool. We're going to look at some slides where he was busy storing up resources for the war, building a broad wall for the war, and securing a water supply for the war. Securing the water supply in Jerusalem, which would be his final hold-up hole against an Assyrian assault. But to see their second greatest city, Lachish, being laid waste during a time of siege made King Hezekiah repent. And I'm looking at the 2 Kings chapter 18 text in the upper right-hand corner. It says, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, King Sennacherib of Assyria came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. You see, the Bible is recording with great humility the destruction that Assyria is laying waste upon them. King Hezekiah of Judah sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I have done wrong. Withdraw from me, and whatever you impose, I will bear. And the king of Assyria demanded of King Hezekiah of Judah 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. And King Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house. And at that time, Hezekiah stripped the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord and from the doorposts that King Hezekiah of Judah had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria. A very, very humble testimony here in 2 Kings chapter 18. And the question that people sometimes would have is this amount of money real? It seems so fantastical and fantastically large. Is this some sort of spiritual metaphor, or is this the amount of money that the king actually demanded? Well, we have an answer to that. And in our lower left-hand corner, you'll see an Assyrian record written in cuneiform of the tribute that was paid by King Hezekiah. And it says that King Hezekiah did indeed pay 30 talents of gold. Now, it also says that he paid 800 talents of silver rather than 300 that the Bible records. I don't know why there's a difference there. But of course, in terms of money and wealth, the 30 talents of gold is bigger than the 300 or 800 talents of silver. But it's recorded this way. So we should understand it's probably indeed that amount of money that was literally transferred, or wealth transferred from Judah to Assyria. And to help us put things in context, we find in various Assyrian royal inscriptions a record of tribute that was paid. And it turns out that this amount of tribute that Judah paid, while it was punishing, while it was very large, it wasn't the greatest amount of tribute that the Assyrians had demanded. It was the third largest amount of gold that they'd ever demanded, and it was the eighth largest amount of silver that they ever demanded and recorded paid. And so I think this helps us understand that even when we encounter numbers that seem beyond imagine, they maybe were indeed not a way of ancient Near Eastern storytelling that's exaggerated. They may indeed be exactly as they are reported. It helps us understand the literature. That's what archaeology, in this case, helps us understand how to interpret this account, whether it should be taken quite literally or whether it should be taken with some different understanding of how ancient Near Eastern people tell story. Well, let's go to King Hezekiah's preparations, storing up resources. One thing we see is that in Lachish, that great fortified city that was besieged, that King Hezekiah tried to save by tribute, we find that King Hezekiah had sent resources there. We find, I believe, 200 jug handles that have this imprint of Lamelech, L-M-L-K, meaning to the king or belonging to the king. These inscripted jars are found in Lachish, and as one archaeologist observes, it demonstrates a careful preparation to counter Sennacherib's likely route of invasion. It suggests, as the Bible does, it's archaeological evidence that suggests that Judah was a well-organized nation, centrally run authority under the king, King Hezekiah, that the king was interested in protecting his domain and had the resources to do that, and so sends out these resources to Lachish to help them. It's not every city-state for themselves, but rather, no, those are cities under the monarchy of Judah, and King Hezekiah takes responsibility and sends them resources. So he's storing up resources to help fight the war that he understands is coming to him. Well, another thing that King Hezekiah does is he wants to defend the city of Jerusalem. That's where his palace is. That's where the capital is. That's where the temple is. That's where a large population is. And it says here in 2 Chronicles that King Hezekiah worked resolutely to rebuild all the broken sections of the wall and to raise up towers on it. He also built an outer wall and reinforced it with supporting terraces of the city of David, and he produced an abundance of weapons and shields. Yes, King Hezekiah is preparing for war. I call your attention to the yellow line. That's the city wall that King Hezekiah inherited from his dad. You can't see that wall today in Jerusalem. It's been torn down. It's underground. You have to dig to find evidence of that wall, and you can dig and find evidence of that wall. It's a modern day photograph or satellite photograph or elevation photograph of Jerusalem. You can see the Temple Mount in the upper portion of that yellow shape. Well, King Hezekiah built this outer wall, this blue line, the King Hezekiah's wall or the broad wall. That blue line you can see is expanding to the west and to the south. The population of Jerusalem is greatly expanded in part from all the refugees that came from Israel. When the Assyrians came and they conquered and they took the 10 tribes of Israel away, well, many people escaped by escaping to Judah, and they came to Jerusalem. And now King Hezekiah is building a wall to protect this new population that is surrounding Jerusalem and its old wall. I would call your attention on the right-hand side of that picture. There's a little dot named the Gihon Spring. The Gihon Spring is the source of water for Jerusalem. And it was outside the wall, the old wall, the one that King Hezekiah inherited. But when he built the new wall, the broad wall, he wanted to make sure that the water supply would be protected, from the enemy. And that's an important consideration in how to build this wall. I will say one more thing. There is this sort of peachy colored shape, and it's called today's wall. It is a wall that looks ancient, it looks medieval, and it is medieval. If you go to Israel today, it's really the only wall that is above ground, and it looks wonderful and it looks old, but it comes from the age of the Ottoman Empire, and it's a millennium and a half after the time of Jesus. It has nothing to do with the Bible, and so we just want to remember what you see is not the important part. The important and historical part is virtually all underground. Well, let's look at that blue wall. You look at the outline in blue and you find that there's a little section that's red. It looks almost like a little red caterpillar on top of the blue line. It's known as the broad wall that's exposed by an archaeological excavation, discovered in 1970. So much of what we find is new, and they had to dig down and around to find this wall. And you see a picture of that wall, a section of that wall that's been reconstructed or at least excavated. And you see a red oblong shape, and it has a height stick or a measuring stick. That is how high the wall used to be when it was built. It's about 17 feet wide, and it's about 20 feet tall. The broad wall, the strong wall, Hezekiah's outer wall, by whatever name you call it, Hezekiah built this wall to defend against an Assyrian assault against Jerusalem. And again, that is, I'm noting the Gihon Spring is down there on the Kidron Valley side of the old wall, the wall that King Hezekiah inherited, but he built a wall around it so the enemy could not have direct access to the spring. So we know that the Gihon Spring is a source of water for Jerusalem, that the king would build a wall around the Gihon Spring to protect it against the enemy taking advantage of it. And this is what we find in 2 Chronicles chapter 32. When King Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come and that he intended to wage war against Jerusalem, he consulted with his officials and military staff about blocking off the water from the springs outside the city. And they helped him. They gathered a large group of people who blocked all the springs in the stream that flowed through the land. Why should the kings of Assyria come and find plenty of water, they said. Because the Gihon Spring produces a lot of water. It actually overflows into the Kidron Valley and is used for irrigation down there. Lots of streams came from the Gihon Spring to irrigate the land. And so building a wall around the Gihon Spring, that's great, so no one can come to it, but that doesn't actually make sure that the water doesn't flow down the hill with these streams. If I block up the streams, the water has to go somewhere, and so King Hezekiah has a plan. We'll block up the streams and we'll create a tunnel, and that tunnel will lead to a new and large reservoir, and that new and large reservoir is called Siloam Pool. So they cut a big reservoir into the ground, and they cut it on the south side of the city, and it would have been outside the old city wall, but it's inside the new city wall that King Hezekiah builds. So he has this very large rock-cut reservoir. Well, we know something about water. It only flows downhill. Water does not flow uphill. And so two teams start to cut a tunnel that goes from Gihon Spring to this new reservoir, the Pool of Siloam. One team starts from the spring, one team starts from the pool. Now, the team that starts from the spring has the easy job in some respect. The easy job is that they know that they're cutting the tunnel at the right height because water is flowing from the Gihon Spring. If they were to cut a tunnel and they would find themselves getting into dry land, then the tunnel is going uphill. If they're cutting a tunnel and they find themselves walking into chest-high water, they're digging the tunnel too deep. Just keep digging the tunnel until it's the right height, perhaps at your mid-calf or knee. Just keep digging the tunnel at that level, and then the water will flow downhill and continue to flow. The other side, they did the best they could, guessing what the right height was. Are we going uphill? Are we going downhill? It turns out that if you look at the tunnel from the Gihon side, the tunnel is only about 5 feet high. And that's because they know exactly where the water level is that they need to be. From the Siloam side, the tunnel is actually in some places 16 feet high because it's hard to know what height to build the tunnel. Are we appropriately going slowly uphill? Is this deep enough so that when we meet, the water will flow downhill from the Gihon Spring to the Siloam Pool? Now, the tunnel is 1,760 feet long, and you see that I point to a part that's called the meeting point. And it looks like the Siloam team were digging to the northeast, and the Gihon Spring team were digging to the southwest. But instead of coming to the same point, they were going parallel. They were going to go past each other. But when they got close, they knew that. And then they started to dig towards each other. The story goes that people were on the hill banging the ground, and they were listening for the banging so they could follow how the banging was, and they would dig the tunnel in that direction. Early on, they're trying to follow some weaknesses in the ground. It's not all the same strength, and so they follow not only, it's not a straight path between these. If you had modern boring equipment, you'd probably just go from Siloam Pool to the Gihon Spring, but instead they're following what they can in the weakness of the rock. And when they get close, they start shouting to each other and start digging towards each other. And they actually are able to talk through the wall when they're just a few feet away. Well, let me just say one more thing, just to tantalize you about the Gihon Spring. The Gihon Spring, if it's not protected by a wall, invaders could actually go into the spring and climb various tunnels to get inside the wall of the city of David, the old wall that was there. And indeed, that is exactly what the Bible says David did with his invaders. They went to the well, they climbed up the well, and then they climbed up this underground trail that brought them beneath the wall and into the city. And that's how David and his soldiers captured the Jebusite city and made it Jerusalem for themselves. Oh, you see the picture of the man standing in the water? Today, if you visit Israel, you can yourself walk through King Hezekiah's tunnel. May get your shoes wet. In fact, you probably will. Depending whether or not it's wet season or dry season. You will probably get your feet wet. In this case, this man got his pants wet up to his waist. When this tunnel was first rediscovered by Christopher Warren in the 1800s, it was filled with silt, and there was barely breathing room for him. And he writes in his journal about how he would be crawling along in this tunnel with barely room for his chest, barely enough air to breathe. There would be obstacles he would have to dig out of his way, refuse that had washed down this channel. So for him, 5 feet would have been quite the luxury. But today, you don't have to worry about that unless you're claustrophobic. Well, at the Pool of Siloam side, about, I think, 20 feet in the tunnel, was discovered an inscription written in ancient Hebrew describing the building of this tunnel. And there was there's a space for a replica, excuse me, for a duplicate message on the other side, on the Gihon Spring side. We see where it would have been mounted onto the tunnel wall, but we've never found that inscription. But on the Pool of Siloam side, we have this inscription. It was taken away by the Ottoman Empire, and it's in a museum in Turkey. But an exact replica is mounted on the wall today, so that if you go and visit King Hezekiah's tunnel, you can see this plaque where it was located. And it provides this description of what is going on as they finally, the two teams finally meet in the middle and call to one another. And it reminds us that the city is above. This is in some places 150 feet. The tunnel is in some places 150 feet below the surface. And so you can imagine how difficult it would be to follow somebody tapping on the surface with a big rod and you figuring out whether or not you need to go straight, turn right, or turn left. Very difficult. And the idea that they could do this at all is pretty amazing. Well, it wasn't until 2004 that we actually discovered the Pool of Siloam. There was some underground water accident. I think it was a sewer main, but it could have been a water main. There was an underground accident. The excavators come to repair that. They always bring an archaeologist with them in case they encounter something interesting. They did. They found some cut stones. The archaeologists say, stop. It's time for us to figure out what's going on here. And indeed, they found the Pool of Siloam. It has 3 tiers of terraces with 4 steps going down between each terrace. Most of the pool is below ground. All was at one point, had to be excavated. And still, most of the pool is below ground because it's on private property. But with ground penetrating radar, we can find the dimensions of this pool. We know how it was shaped. And someday we may get permission to dig in people's backyards and complete the excavation of the Pool of Siloam. Now, what you are seeing is not the reservoir that King Hezekiah built. It is believed that this pool is built on top, exactly on top of that reservoir. This pool was built much later, but this pool has interest to us as Christians because there's a Bible story in the New Testament about the Pool of Siloam. It's about Jesus healing the blind man, and this comes out of the Gospel of John in the 9th chapter. You may recall Jesus and his disciples were walking along. They see a man who was blind from birth, and his disciples asked this question, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus says, no, it was neither him nor his parents. It was for the glory of God this day that you would see. And it says Jesus spit on the ground, made some mud with saliva, put it in the man's eyes, and he said, go, wash in the Pool of Siloam. And so the man went and washed and came home seeing. And then when he was questioned by the authorities, he gave the same account. How then are your eyes open, they asked. He replied, the man they called Jesus made some mud and put it in my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. And so I went and washed, and then I could see. This is at the same location as the reservoir that King Hezekiah built. And now that we know where the tunnel is, and one more feature, it really helps us. So let's look at this cartoon on the right, this artistic rendering of the Pool of Siloam in the time of Jesus. You'll notice that in the distance is the southern wall of Jerusalem. Now, Now, that would have been the outer wall that we are talking about, perhaps. There's a wall. And in King Hezekiah's time, he also would take advantage of that wall that he built for security. But remember, the reservoir is being filled by a spring that continues to provide water. Once the reservoir is full, what do you do with the excess water? It continues to come from the spring. You don't want it to go down the hill in Kidron, because there the ground is such that the water forms streams and just flows into the valley. Good for agriculture, but bad if you're trying to deny enemy armies water. It turns out that here, at this location, if the water is brought forth through the wall, it doesn't form a stream. Instead, it's absorbed into the ground. The ground here is more porous, and the excess water that comes out of the reservoir will simply be absorbed back into the ground, and there will be no water source for the Assyrian army or any other army to take advantage of. And so we believe that the reservoir that King Hezekiah made, which we call the Pool of Siloam, had a drainage from overflow that went out the southern wall and did not result in making water available to his enemies. Now, in this rendering of the Pool of Siloam, we look to the lower right-hand corner, and you see these steps. This is an artistic interpretation of what we've already talked about, the Pilgrim's Way, or the stepped street, the street that was built probably by Pontius Pilate to enable pilgrims, when they came to Jerusalem, to walk up these stairs all the way to the temple. Today, that is almost entirely underground, as was the Pool of Siloam until we excavated a portion of it that was on land that we had access to. The Pilgrim's Way is underground. In some places, it's only underground by 8 feet or 10 feet. In other places, it's underground by 50 feet. The city has really been built up since the time of Jesus. You may remember that the Pool of Siloam in Jesus' time, we think may have been used as a mikveh, a pool of water that is fed by flowing water from the Kidron spring, fed by flowing water through Hezekiah's tunnel. That mikveh must have flowing water. And it's a large pool, and when hundreds of thousands of pilgrims came, they could walk through this pool to become ritualistically clean before they made their ascent to the temple to worship the Lord God Most High. Well, that's our lesson for this week. Next week, we go in an entirely new path. We'll visit the town of Shiloh or Shiloh, and we'll find out what we're discovering there about this very important city. It was important during the conquest of the Promised Land. It was important during the time of Judges because it's the site where the tabernacle and the worship of God took place. But until then, be well. And I hope you find these lessons both informative and fortifying. That the Bible that we have is a historical record. And when we read it, we can find out real details about people and places and events and outcomes. And we understand then the relationship between the people of faith and their God, and we find out the relationship of God and his people of faith. Well, until next week, take care and be well.